Hello, I am Joshua Burke, an associate professor of history at Smith College. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Gabriele Marcon. We're going to do an interview about his article. Gabriele is a senior postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Economic and Social History at the University of Vienna. He's doing some amazing research that looks at the intersections of economics, of science, of gender, in the sort of venue of early modern mining, and focuses particularly in Europe and Iberian colonies. He received his PhD in history uh, from the European University Institute in 2022, and has also held positions at Durham University, at the Warburg Institute, and the VA Tati, the Harvard Center for Italian and Renaissance Studies. More recently, in 2024, he was awarded an ESPRIT grant by the Austrian Science Foundation, and we'll want to talk to you about your current monograph, Renaissance Underground, German Mining Science and the Quest for Metals in Early Modern Italy. So that's a brief introduction for our audience. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the committee as well for their award. It was really great to see my work sort of like being recognized with that award. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled to have you here, and the Society for Italian Historical Studies would likely to me to read the citation for that award. So this year's Society for Italian Historical Studies Committee awards an honorable mention for an outstanding article on medieval or early modern Italian history to Gabriele Marcon for his article "Boundaries of Knowledge: Books, Experts, and Readers in Early Modern Minds." The article appeared in ISIS, which is a journal of history and science, journal of the History and Science Society in 2025. And the article explores the interactions between scholarly administrations and skilled laborers in the industrial projects of the 16th century. And it uses the mining operations of Montecerboli as a kind of case study for understanding the mine as a workplace, and circulation of knowledge, or the lack of circulation of knowledge in some cases, about the mining industry in the 16th century. It asks questions about the contributions and limitations of written work to the practice of mining, about whether books were enough to become an expert. Ultimately, I think you prove that they are not, but your work shows a kind of social, ethical, and labor hierarchies that are shaped by, in the process of early modern mining, and how skilled practitioners maintain their privileged position in the face of the emergence of these written treaties. And that was the work that I think really excited the committee. So with all that formal stuff out of the way, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about like how you came to your topic and how this became the focus of your scholarship.
Yeah, so I came to this sort of article when I was I was working on my dissertation. I was writing a dissertation on German miners in Renaissance Italy in the 16th century, and I was looking at the economic and social history of those movements, of labor movements, migrations from Central Europe to the Italian peninsula. And I was actually much more interested in sort of the economic dimension of these political and economic strategies that states like Medici Tuscany, for example, or the Republic of Venice implemented in order to gain mining expertise from Central Europe. So I was basically I was focusing on sort of like the migration flows, the sort of the circulation patterns of knowledge. And I was working in the archives in Florence. I was just, thinking about, I was looking at wage payments, for example, payrolls, kind of like very basic economic sort of economic history research. And then I started also to sort of like expand a little bit more the focus on what was happening in other sort of parts of Tuscany. So I was basically looking at the kind of the Versilia, so the Pietrasanta mining district, which is a silver mine.
Mhm.
In the 16th century, it was reopened by Cosimo I de' Medici in 1542, it was also worked by the Etruscan, for example, in the Middle Ages as well. So there's actually a long story of this kind of mining in the, district. But I also wanted to focus on something that went beyond sort of this specific case study, and I kind of like moved a little bit more south to Volterra, for example, and I found basically correspondence between this untrained official Alessandro Cini, which was basically yeah, I would say a middle ranked nobleman from like the countryside, the Tuscan countryside, who was suddenly tasked by Cosimo to find all sorts of mineral you could find in Tuscany, and the correspondence between these two actors, between Cini and Cosimo and the Duke Cosimo, kind of like open up another discussion about many different elements that were kind of like tangential on my research, German expertise, and books, for example, circulating mining books, for example, circulating in Tuscany. So it became basically what was first an economic history of mining. It became also like a history of knowledge, and it raised questions about how expertise was claimed and constructed around identities, for example. And it also kind of like started raising questions about what happened actually in these mines when you have experts, books, and officials trying to sort of like implement these mining operations.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about Alessandro Cini? I found him an interesting figure, and how you go from a minor noble, someone with sort of like a scholarly background, and are suddenly tasked with no real knowledge about overseeing a
Yeah.
large mining operation and these demands to produce right these extracted mineral resources, and how someone who knows nothing about mining tries to fill that gap in the 16th century.
Yeah, yeah, that was actually an interesting case. I think I need to say a little bit more about Cosimo de' Medici
Sure.
first and his economic sort of strategy. So Cosimo came to power in 1537. He becomes the new Duke of the Republic, and then he becomes Grand Duke in 1564. And so in these years, basically, he his sort of implementing economic strategies that are like very aggressive, particularly in terms of like the monopoly production and trade that is kind of creating all around Tuscany. So he's taking over, basically has taken over the grain trade, for example. He has taken over the production of certain luxury goods like coral, for example. And together with Eleanor, the Duchess, they are also massively investing and appropriating land across Tuscany. So he really kind of like creates a sort of a very economic autarky that kind of really allowed him to sort of also appropriate underground wealth, underground minerals. So in 1543, for example, he sort of started extracting. He received basically the lease of the iron ore extraction on the Elba Island, for example. So he becomes basically a mining entrepreneur. He is like this ambivalent figure that very kind of sort of widespread in early modern Europe. The prince that is kind of like the owner of mining rights, but in that case is also kind of the sort of principal beneficiary of this enterprises. So his strategy basically is creating monopolies production monopolies in mining by partnering up with like the no local nobility and very few sort of like elected people, elected persons and figures of the Florentine merchant environment. And Cini is one of them. He's kind of like he's around Volterra by the mid 16th century. There's very little about his family history, for example, but we know that at one point he, in order to advance his political career in terms of, you know, the administrative roles and managerial roles that he could achieve in the political administration of Tuscany, he would have advanced those kind of roles only by getting the favor, basically, of Cosimo de' Medici. So it's a very clientele sort of relationship between Cini and Cosimo. And I mean, I wasn't able to find when this relationship started. But apparently, when Cini was kind of like roaming around Montecerboli in this very kind of like hilly Tuscan landscapes, he wrote to the Duke saying, you know, I've been talking to people telling me that here a lot of minerals were found, and this is true. This is actually one of this kind of regions that is called the Colline Metallifere. So it's a very important extractive sites in the Middle Ages, for example, in the 15th century as well. So there is kind of like a memory of this former mining activity, and Cini wants to sort of like kind of bring the Duke Cosimo's attention to these extraction sites in order to become a more powerful and or in order to advance his political roles within the mining administration. After being tasked with finding all different minerals, he also becomes the captain of Montecerboli. So he becomes basically the sort of like the Medici administrator in that specific town.
But he doesn't know much about mining.
He doesn't know anything about mining. That's the problem. So he doesn't know. I mean, he started. I mean, the interesting path. I mean, it's a very interesting path because he started by saying, yeah, so I'm looking around basically. I don't know very much what to search for. He's reading some of the treatises, the most important treatises in early modern Europe. One of them is the Bermannus from by Georg Agricola, published in 1530, and it's a dialogue between. It's a very sort of. It's more about the vocabulary of mining,
Mhm.
the sort of like the humanist tradition around sort of underground resources. But he's also the dialogue. It's the treatise is also a dialogue between an unskilled practitioner and a very skilled figure in the German speaking minds. So he's basically telling Cosimo, I'm reading about this, but there's not so much of a specific knowledge that can
Mhm.
help me sort of identify, for example, copper veins instead of silver veins, for example. I don't really know where to start digging shafts or whether it is actually the case that I should dig shafts right now or just like start kind of like creating that open pit mines, for example. So he has like a lot of questions, and he's trying to find answers about how to deal with the task that you, Cosimo, kind of distributed. It's interesting to see. That was my question. So my main question was how did untrained figures like Cini, for example, who has like a completely different sort of interest that is not necessarily mining. But how did they, and many other figures in early modern Europe, how did they advance knowledge of mining when they had available practical and codified expertise and how did this dialogue basically took place. And I think that the correspondence between him and Cosimo was actually very important in terms of to reconstruct how to reconstruct basically this practical sort of like application of mining knowledge.
Right. And, you know, so he's reading these sort of instructional manuals to try to get some knowledge of the situation. The instructional manuals are framed around this conversation between a kind of expert overseer and a worker, but he's also then working with these highly skilled German miners who are being brought into the region. And I think sort of the interplay between those different modes of knowledge and these like fictive conversations, but these perhaps real conversations that he's also having, though I know we don't know specifically what those interactions are or their limits to what we know, are part of what I found so fascinating about this. So I guess on the flip side of this coin, could you tell us a little bit more about who these skilled artisans are and these German miners, what we know about?
Yeah, yeah, so that's I think the interesting part of the fun part of the whole kind of the research that led to the article was exactly the presence of both codified and practical knowledge
Right.
in Tuscany, which is, by the way, not a very productive mining region at all. So the scholarship on mining, on early modern mining, for good reasons, concentrate more on Central and Eastern Europe and on Spanish America, of course. And Renaissance Italy is kind of like at the periphery of this of this scholarship. But mining in the early modern period also works in very ambiguous terms. So you have basically a lot of people migrating in to unknown regions or like uncharted territories, like for example Medici Tuscany, and the news of these reopened mines in Pietrasanta and the fact that the Medici Duke was actually setting to work in these
Yes.
territories kind of attracted a lot of German miners. And particularly these miners were actually from the Ore Mountains, so the one of the most important productive mine in the 16th century, which is Joachimsthal which is now in the Czech Republic, and many different other miners were actually from the Schwarz mining region in Tyrol, for example. And so the Duke is kind of like there's like these migrations worked in a way that in the same way that kind of like urban artisans, skilled artisans would basically come to Florence or Venice or Milan. So there's a first kind of like recruitment by Medici officials, for example, that kind of try to sort of like lure them into these mining regions. And then when mines are actually working in full swing, then a lot of other people come from these regions. So the first group and the one that I'm actually the article is basically looking at this first group of 12 or 13 German men and women. So we are talking about families coming together. Women were also a great part of the labor work of the workforce. And there are also like many different instances that allow to kind of like reconstruct their knowledges about mining in this period. So they came from Joachimsthal in 1546, and one of them, the most important figure, is this mine manager from Nuremberg, who actually recruited other miners from Joachimsthal. And it is actually extremely interesting to see how a lot of documents and a lot of sources have survived about not only this migration, but also about their presence, what they did in Tuscany. Many of these sources are actually in German. So there is like an enormous wealth of information about them. So to make it kind of like say in a simpler way, these are actually very, very skilled metal workers who actually forge their expertise in the most important mining industries of early modern Europe.
Right. And one of the things you show also is that we have these sort of hierarchies between like overseer and skilled artisan, but we also have these hierarchies within the mining groups and hierarchies that are established, right, between these expert foreign laborers and local miners too. Could you elaborate on that kind of interplay?
Yeah, I think I was trying to see. I mean, I was kind of like reading the literature on the kind of like the history of science about circulation and the circulation of knowledge, which is extremely important if we think about, for example, colonial settings, for example, in Spanish America and in Southeast Asia. And I was thinking about, and normally the idea that you have from early modern Europe is that no matter what happens, if you have people working together in a single workplace, be it like a workshop, for example, or like a naval shipyard, for example, circulation, knowledge circulated in a way or in another. So there are instances in which this kind of collaborative, particularly in a collaborative work setting, like mining, for example, you have basically people who kind of like transmit and transfer knowledge and people who learn from kind of this sort of engagement with this collaborative work. But in that sense, but in that setting, I think in my kind of case, migration completely disrupted a little bit this sort of like this idea because when German miners come to Tuscany, they also sort of set up very high standards for like workers, and these are actually standards that are sort of they are kind of impossible to achieve by local miners who are kind of like Tuscan Italian miners are just like some of them are peasants, kind of like alternating between agricultural work and mining, and some others were sort of like these captains, for example, like Cini, who kind of maybe had some sort of like administrative knowledge about, how to report expenditures, how to sort of like set up the flows of materials and capitals, but they had little understanding of what was happening in the mines. And this is something this kind of like practical knowledge kind of it is a little bit absent in Renaissance Italy. You have basically Vannoccio Biringuccio, for example. You have a lot of kind of Aldobrandi, for example, other kind of natural philosophers who are kind of like also practical knowers, and they are kind of like engaging with nature and material, but they have very little experience about how to manage large scale mining enterprises and to set up kind of like a very organized administration and how to sort of create these hierarchies of labor and this chain of command that was extremely important in Central Europe, particularly in large scale enterprises. So with this kind of baggage, German miners, first of all, demanded higher salaries. So they tell the Duke there is a difference between a German and an Italian miner. So they set up kind of like different wage payments. And of course, they dominate the key roles of the mining administration. So the manager is a German. German women are actually much more involved in paid work than Italian women, for example. Assayers, overseers, which are actually very important for like the organization of labor in the mines, are also Germans. So and most importantly, they also transfer the legal knowledge of the mines. So the statutes of the Medici mining enterprise are issued in 1547, 1548, and these are actually copy pasted sort of version of legal ordinances in Germany, for example. And there's like a clear kind of a clear link between that legal administration and the one in Medici Tuscany.
So does Alessandro Cini just end up deferring to these minors, or do you get a sense of like what the back and forth between uh these two players, what it looks like?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Alessandro Cini is probably, I mean, he has some contacts with German miners. Very few. Sometimes this like central mining administration in Pietrasanta sent out a couple of experts to Volterra, for example. In many different, there are actually many different episodes, but I didn't actually, I couldn't I couldn't reconstruct this kind of dialogues
Right.
between German miners and Chini, but I sort of like had a sense of what dialogue would actually mean because in Pietrasanta, for example, there are a lot of Medici officials like Chini and interacting with sort of German miners, and it's a mess. I mean, it's some of this, some of the letters because the Medici officials complain a lot about these Germans, and the Germans complain a lot about these Medici officials. And some of the letters, the back and forth with Cosimo in Florence are extremely funny. So sometimes you actually have German Medici officials saying these Germans they eat a lot, they party a lot, they drink too much, they don't do any work. Why do we have to pay them so much? And the Germans are actually saying Italian miners are like peasants, they don't know anything about mining, they can't actually do whatever. Give me more Germans from Central Europe. I need more skilled operators in that sense. So, in a more serious sort of way, there is actually this very important hierarchy that is constructed around expertise. That is kind of like embodied in certain figures, like one of these German manager, the one that was given the key to Pietrasanta, for example. He basically doesn't want anyone to look at him or like kind of be next to him when he's assaying, for example, when he's refining metals in the workshop. He's very jealous. And also, and I think for good reasons, because if you think about the fact that these people came with all their families to a different place,
Yep.
and they kind of like recreated sort of like the setting and the framework that they wanted, that they had in Germany, for example. So they kind of like invested a lot
It's a
in this.
migration story that you're telling.
Exactly, in this migration. So I mean, and also the wages that they receive from the Duke were based on their skills, on their expertise. So I mean, if they lose that expertise, then I mean, the life would have been a completely different pair of hands, I guess. So I mean, it's interesting to see how. I mean, it's true that there are ways in which knowledge circulated, but I think migration kind of like disrupted a little bit this concept.
Yeah, well, and I think that it means it's that interaction between knowledge circulation and migration, and then how it informs the creation of these very complex sort of multimodal hierarchies that is so exciting about this work. Can you
Mm.
tell me a little bit about how it fits into the larger project that you're doing, or how it leads into that?
Yeah, so that was like one a part of a chapter of my dissertation that I'm now turning into a book that is basically about this sort of transfer of German mining science in Medici Tuscany. So I guess this is basically at the end of the sort of the book that I'm writing. And it's much, I mean, it's kind of part of this kind of this larger case studies about how kind of that specific German mining science circulate in Renaissance Italy. And by German mining science, I mean a lot of different things. It's not just about metalworking. It's not just about sort of the organization of labor, for example, but it's much more about this kind of legal expertise that was transferred from Germany uh, to um, to Italy, for example. And so that specific case study allows me to sort of like look at how this circulation failed, basically. And it's interesting because this failure it fits very well into the whole history of mining, 16th century mining in Tuscany, which is also an history of failure. So this kind of like recruitment of German experts, the circulation of a lot of people coming from Central European mines, this kind of building up hierarchies, creating identities around expertise, and so on, in the end, didn't lead anything to anything specifically productive in Tuscany. So the mines are shut down in Pietrasanta after like about 50 years of production. Some of the mines are actually in southern Tuscany become a little bit more productive, but it's not about silver. It's more alum, lead, for example, other minerals. But they are not, I mean, this transfer is in the end is not successful. And the whole mining industry in Tuscany, the mining industry that Cosimo tried to replicate exactly by looking at the model of German mining, didn't really work in the end. So I think this case study is basically the end part of the book, which is sort of like a little bit more about how political economic strategies necessitated foreign expertise to sort of implement local projects.
Well, I think that idea of like looking at the history of failures is so important because it pulls us away from these like teleological narratives where we only look at sort of how we get to success. I guess so. What I'd like to finish is asking sort of like a broader question about how you see this work here contributing to sort of a wider scholarship on modes of knowledge exchange and labor throughout the 16th century broadly, and how it sort of fits into these bigger paradigms about how we think about the development of science and labor and
So the idea was basically to sort of connect my interest in economic and labor history with like general questions asked by history of science literature. And there are like mostly two kind of like basic questions. The one is the question on how artisans and sort of and workers learn about nature by engaging with everyday work, for example. And you have like wonderful work by Pamela Smith, Pamela Long in the history of technology, for example, and this kind of like relationship between human and the bodily exchanges between human and nature that sort of like allowed artisans to grasp sort of natural philosophical element in the early modern period. And on the other hand, the other big historiography that I wanted to contribute to was about the circulation. I mean, the question about circulation of knowledge, the circulation of books, for example. We didn't talk about it, but there's a wonderful episode that kind of saw that basically has sort of like all the elements of like the circulation of books in early modern Europe. Cosimo asking for this codified knowledge, these books by Georg Agricola in Schwarz, but nobody has it in this kind of like big mining industries because they are not for professionals or like for operators to read. They are just for like elites actually, an elites audience basically. And he gets the book actually from a nobleman from Bohemia in the end. So there is like this idea that that this book culture spread basically knowledge around, but it was of very little help for like a practical operator on the ground, basically. So
the
these are
translation process too, which is you
sorry.
you doc also the translation process here, right? Which you
Oh yeah,
document, right?
yeah.
These books are also being translated into vernaculars in the middle of these projects, and
Yeah, that's one of the most unanswered questions of the article. Who translated that book? Which I have sort of like no knowledge about that yet. But yeah, at one point the book was translated from Latin to from German to Italian, much more much before, well before the canonical Italian translation, which is the 1563 translation of Michelangelo Florio. So yeah, it's a question of how also kind of like the circulation of these books really helped practitioners on the ground.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview.
Thank you
Um,
very much. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you very
yeah.
much.
So have a good day, and I hope to see you later.